Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Anna Ullman. I work for the City of Greenfield in the Community and Economic Development Department. Thank you on behalf of the city and also Mayor DeSorger for coming out tonight to talk about the city's housing needs. Just as a little background, the city received a grant last year from the state Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities to perform a housing needs assessment and housing plan for the city. So that's where the funding for this project has come from. And the idea is in two parts. First, to assess what are the needs with regard to housing in the city in terms of amount, type, affordability. And then in the second portion, which we'll address later this summer, to look at strategies for meeting those needs. How can we, on the city level and the community level, work towards those goals? So our plan for tonight is to start with a presentation from Community Scale, and Jeff is here from Community Scale to show some of the research that they've done so far. We're going to record that portion of the presentation so that we can post it online afterwards for people to look at. We'll also post the slides because, as you're going to see, there's a ton of really interesting data for you to look at. And then we're going to have a pretty open discussion about people's own experiences with housing in the city and needs that you would like to identify, in particular, things that aren't easily captured by the sort of metadata that we're going to look at on the front end. As I said, later this summer, we're going to move on to the strategies portion of the housing plan, and we'll have a follow-up community meeting at that point. So we're going to start by zooming out, looking at some of these big picture trends. But of course, when it comes to the housing crisis, everyone as an individual here has a piece of the puzzle of what the needs are that aren't being met by our current housing stock. So we have some handouts for people to sort of guide your thinking for the discussion questions. We could collect them if you have good ideas on yours that you want us to have, but it's really just for you to think about the kinds of questions we're going to be asking in the discussion portion. So again, thank you all so much for coming out and for your participation in the discussion. And without further ado, welcome to Jeff Sauser from Community Scale.
Yeah. Thank you. All right, my name is Jeff Sauser with Community Scale. Let me just turn off the volume on this thing. It's very distracting. We're a consulting firm that specializes in urban planning, housing needs assessments, housing policy, zoning, those sorts of things. Based in Massachusetts. I happen to be based in Greenfield. I've lived here for 9 or 10 years, so really excited to work in my own backyard and bring some of my skills and experience to my own community. We've also got another team member on the phone who will introduce himself. Today, we're going to introduce the project, building on what Anna said. I'm going to share some findings from the initial stage of our housing needs assessment analysis. Trying not to take up too much time with that, so then we have a chance to discuss and gather some priorities, some goals, some ideas to help us translate the analysis into ideas for action. So my team includes myself, Nels Nelson, and Sarah Brent McCoy. Those are the folks from Community Scale that will be helping us on this process. Nels and Sarah Brent were out here last month. And then Jeff Levine, who I believe is on the phone, and I'll unmute him in a second, is a sub-consultant with us. He brings a lot of experience on the implementation side, crafting policies and strategies to execute the ideas that we come up with together as a community. I'll let him speak in a second to flesh that out a little bit more. But first, an overview of the project, just the trajectory of the scope, the schedule. So we began last month. We'll finish near the end of the summer in July. And we start with a housing needs assessment, which is a largely quantitative exercise on one hand. And there's also a review of the literature, which just means looking at the past plans and studies that have been done to see where we can kind of pick up where others have left off, and then try to set some targets and goals there. In parallel with that, we're doing stakeholder and community engagement. So we're talking to local stakeholders in the community, some of which are in the room right now that I've already talked to. We're having meetings like this. So this is the first of 2 meetings that we'll have through the course of the project. And then we're meeting with various people with the city at key milestones along the way, just to make sure we're on the right track and we're coordinated with the right departments and other leadership. We'll then take the analysis and engagement and build out our housing production strategy and craft a plan deliverable that takes 2 forms. One is a more conventional report, although it'll be very graphic and engaging, and then also a website or dashboard version of the same information just to help spread the content that much further and a bit more an interactive way to interface with it. So one of the key outcomes is a really robust implementation strategy. So I'd like to ask Jeff Levine to introduce himself a little bit more beyond what I did, and then also talk a bit about how we're approaching this piece of the work.
Great. Thanks, Jeff, and thanks to city staff and the mayor. I'm excited to work on this project. I love working on these kinds of projects with local communities trying to solve housing needs. So my piece of this project is probably a little bit closer to the end once the sort of needs are identified and some of the gaps in what Greenfield can provide are sort of listed, and we have a better sense of what the target is. And what I've worked on with communities is a lot of how to implement strategies based on those identified needs. So a little background, I was the planning director in Brookline, Massachusetts for about 8 years. I worked in Somerville before that. Then I was in Portland, Maine for about 7 years, and now I teach at MIT and I'm a consultant. So, you know, the thing I really like to do is sort of figure out how to take these tools and apply them, like I said. The way I like to think about it, there's sort of an overall toolbox. There's a sort of it's like you have a toolbox and it has a drill in it, it has screwdrivers, it has wrenches, it has all these different tools. So you see on the slide some examples of different types of tools you could use to address housing gaps. Now, you wouldn't use all of them. I mean, the analogy, again, to not break it, but to stretch it a little bit is, you know, if you need to fix the sink, you're not going to reach for the screwdriver. You're going to reach for, you know, the tool that can fix the sink, depending on what's wrong with it. So you have this whole set of tools, but you probably are only going to implement a certain subset of them. Now, how are you going to pick that sort of subset? There's a couple of different variables there. One is really what are the needs? So depending on the level of housing need and the affordability gap and what types of housing are needed, you could look at different tools. You also want to look at the local assets and interests. So if you have a community that has a lot of surplus municipal land, that's an asset that community has that other communities may not have. So you might want to look towards those assets, and at the same time also look towards local preferences. So, you know, regardless of the need, some communities are more willing to look at tax concessions for affordable housing development than others. And I think it's important to internalize those preferences and not shy away from them so that you can get an effective plan that gets implemented. The last thing I'll say is within each of these tools, think of it as a you know, a wrench that you can adjust. So you have these tools and they're sort of general, like inclusionary zoning. But within inclusionary zoning, there's all sorts of pieces you can change. You can change the affordability level, the percentage of affordable units, options to provide on or off-site units. So these tools are adjustable, just like tools are in real life. So, you know, that's another piece of it. Based on what sort of width you need for that wrench to be, you can widen it or narrow it based on Greenfield's specific needs. So that's where I'm going to sort of fit in on this and sort of try to recommend some effective tools to address the needs that are identified in this study. I think with that, I'll hand it back to Jeff.
Thank you, Jeff. And Jeff will be on the line when we're done the presentation if there's any questions for him about some of these ideas, for example. All right, so now to the housing needs assessment. First, an overview of what the planning document will consist of, the sorts of things we're going to address tonight, and then also to follow. So we structure these plans with an overview piece that just states the goals and what you're going to find, an executive summary that will also be represented on the dashboard version, the online piece. And we look at the people of the community first, and then we also look at the place. So that's the housing stock. And then how well do those two fit together? How well aligned is the housing stock with the people that are there here today and also the people we expect to see here in the future? How does that translate into demand for new housing? And what do we do with that information? How do we implement policies to capture the aspects of that demand that we want to see in our future? As I said before, there's a number of studies and plans that have been done in Greenfield over the past decade. One thing when I'm elsewhere in the country that I brag about with Greenfield is that we, for example, the Sustainable Master Plan is the comprehensive plan for the community that was done 10 years ago, where they're just starting another one. They're done every 10 years or so for most communities. And our implementation committee is still active on the last one. So a lot of times these plans just get completed, put on a shelf, move on to something else. Here, Greenfield takes planning very seriously and really gets the things done that we set out to do with these plans. So I'm just as a resident proud about that. Yeah. Good. it was not the main focus, that's for sure. I was able to find a little bit in there, but the situation is much different right now. The world is different. The economy's gone through several fits and starts since then. So I think in the next round, it's going to be front and center, I would assume.
John, can you repeat any questions that are raised there? Because those of us who are remote can't hear them.
Sure. She was just commenting that housing didn't seem to be a central, it wasn't very prominent in the past master plan.
Thank you.
Yeah. So just I wanted to highlight some of the goals. I mean, one of the things that I noticed is that many of the goals that were established in these plans are still relevant today. Some of these plans aren't all that old to begin with. Some of the strategies and goals that were articulated have been executed. The zoning, for example, has been modified pretty extensively to enable more housing options by right. The Community Preservation Act has been implemented and deployed a couple times, and that's just a way of taking extra tax money and spending it on things like affordable housing, retrofits, and also public open space, but just discretionary funding for the city to do with what they want to do to further their goals. The Downtown Revitalization Plan was looking at redeveloping vacant and underutilized buildings. That's another goal that was expressed in the past. It's something that's happening now. Another thing I brag about when I'm elsewhere in the country is the Wilson's Project, just taking a building like that and giving it new life. That's actually pretty rare. So Greenfield's really moving in the right direction, and it's a great time to have this conversation. So now I'll give you highlights from our analysis. We'll deliver a more extensive and detailed version of this, but just key takeaways to help kind of calibrate you for the conversation in terms of what's going on in Greenfield in particular and how that relates to housing, how we might want to think about it. So first of all, some demographics that do play directly into housing need. Maybe the most striking demographic in Greenfield is just how quickly the population is aging and how many people will be 65 and over the next decade. So for this project, just for context, we're thinking out about 10 years. It's calibrated to the comprehensive planning cycle. So most of this is thinking between 2024, 2034. And over that time, Greenfield will add, if previous trends extend, 1,400 more people in the 65 plus age group. That's people moving here perhaps. It's also people aging into that cohort, but the other age groups are all shrinking. So you might say all the net growth is in the senior age bracket. And as we know, that comes with different housing needs potentially that need to be accommodated a number of different ways, which we can talk about. So other perspectives on the aging piece, Greenfield is older than other communities in the state. So 65% of the community is 65 plus, 36%, sorry, compared to Massachusetts, where it's a quarter of the population. In Greenfield, 21% of the population is 65 and older in one-person households. So just think about people who need maybe less space. Maybe they weren't one-person households before their kids moved out or something, but now it's a small household that might need a small space. That's double the rate across Massachusetts. And then also in Greenfield and surrounding communities, 26% of the population is 65 plus, 1 and 2 person households. So it's just a couple or a single person, and they're living in a 3+ bedroom unit or house. So not to say that all these people want to move out of those houses anytime soon, but likely a subset do. So do people have an option to downsize, for example, or make different use of the extra bedrooms in their home? And these are questions that are more pertinent in Greenfield than the rest of the state. We
John, just an observation, if I can get my video on. I represent that number, the 65 plus. I'm 65. I also, and Jeff Levine will, I think, appreciate this. I know how many smoots it takes to get across the Mass Ave Bridge because I just moved from Metro West Boston. And I'm coming back here after being away. I was here as a child. I'm coming back. And what I'm finding is I'm talking to people around the community and in the valley in general, is that there's a whole bunch of in-migration happening right now with this population. So there's the aging in place population that have been here forever and are suddenly 65 plus. But the reality is that there's also another community, which are people that are either choosing to relocate here or choosing to come back to this area. So I don't think in any way, shape, or form it's one size fit all.
Without a doubt, I think that's right. Immigration is, and it's to some degree a new phenomenon for other age cohorts. Also happen to own a co-working space in town. And a lot of the people that come to us, it's a shared office space for people who work remotely. Get a lot more business after COVID than we did before. People are able to make lifestyle choices, live where they want to live and bring their job with them. And I think
Right.
people are making similar choices in retirement or in later years where they can bring their job. The quality of life here is really great. It's a great place to live and
Right.
retire. And so I think that that phenomenon is across the board. So we could try to flesh that out a bit more in our analysis.
Thank
So a
you.
lot of the work is organized around AMI levels. So just explain what that is for folks who don't know. AMI refers to area median income. So it's just a way of comparing people's income levels, and it calibrates in many cases to different funding programs. HUD looks at it, different cities and communities calibrate different subsidy programs, assistance programs for people in different AMI brackets. So the area median income for Greenfield, which actually refers to Franklin County as a whole, is $93,000 a year. Now, just to compare that to Greenfield specifically, the median income is $53,000, or at least it was in 2022. So lower than the area median income, but we work with the AMI because that's just how a lot of the data comes to us and is digested through policy. So this table breaks down the Greenfield population in terms of those income brackets. Just shows you what the income would be in those different levels, and also what the affordable housing costs would be for people in those different income levels. So affordable housing cost is calibrated to be spending no more than 30% of your income on housing. And that's not just paying your rent and your mortgage, it's also paying your utilities, your insurance, all the money that goes into keeping and maintaining a housing unit. And folks who exceed that number are what we call cost burden. We'll talk about that in a minute. So you can see that there's concentrations at the lower and upper end of the income spectrum. More folks down at the lower end. That's partly because Greenfield's median income is a lot lower than the area median income. But one thing that we noticed was that there's not a whole lot of people in the 80 to 120% AMI. So these are the people kind of the middle of the range income levels, sometimes referred to as the missing middle. And these folks often make a little too much money to qualify for a lot of subsidy programs, but they don't make enough money to afford the skyrocketing cost of conventional market rate housing, and tend to fall through the cracks in many cases. So one just maybe rhetorical question for now is, why is that the smallest group on this table? If they're, you think the middle class, it'd be the middle of the bell curve, and it's kind of the opposite, it's the trough. One theory is that there's just not enough housing at that price point in this community, so those folks can't access this community, but we can flesh that out together, just something to point out. So if we think about the change in incomes over time, looking back and looking forward, not huge changes, but much of the growth projected for the next 10 years or so, we would see at the lower income levels. And this is just, a lot of our projections are projecting past trends forward. So that's a starting point. You don't have to accept the projections if you want to make policy changes that bend the curve a little bit. But as it's been going so far, we would see growth at those lower income levels. So the housing that serves those folks needs to be made more available, so they have somewhere to live by that measure. So a few other breakdowns demographically. Greenfield is not the most diverse place in the world, but it is getting a little more diverse. I don't have the time scale piece here, but much of the diversity, much of the ethnic diversity is concentrated at the lower income levels compared to the upper income levels, which are more white. In terms of household types, so here we're looking at families with children, families without children, and non-family. Non-family can also be single people. So singles in particular tend to be at the lower end of the income spectrum. Families with children tend to be at the higher end of the income spectrum. When we look at the distribution of incomes by age, seniors 65 plus tend to be in the lowest income level. And then at the younger folks, younger households, especially the 45 to 64, tend to be on the upper end. But again, like many of these charts, there's concentrations at the bottom, there's concentrations at the top, and then troughs in the middle too. So again, you just think about what are the different housing needs of these different age groups, look at their income capabilities, and what does that mean for housing types and also affordability and other support programs. So here's cost burden again. So as I said, cost burden refers to someone paying more than 30% of their income on housing. A severely cost burden means you're over 50% of your income on housing. And not surprisingly, the lower income folks tend to be more cost burdened, but the lowest two brackets are more than half cost burden, and below 30% AMI nearly cost burden. So these folks are really having a hard time making ends meet. And there's even cost burden at the upper levels too, just not as severe. This isn't a perfect data set, but just to talk about disabilities a little bit, people at the lower end of the income spectrum, there tends to be more people who have different types of disabilities. Either they're physical, they're ambulatory, so they have a hard time getting around, self-care, independent living limitations. And so those are all more prevalent at the lower income levels than the higher income levels. And so you can imagine the different housing needs those folks would have, the different supports and services they would need integrated with their housing. Yes. 1 second. Use the.
I have a question on the graph. I'm so far away, I can't read any of the text because I'm getting cataract surgery next week. But the gray, what is the gray?
Great. Well, I hope you can throw your glasses away after you get the cataract surgery. The gray is the people without any disability by this measure.
Okay, thank you.
This could just, so then you can see the comparison between the cluster of people who do have them and then how many fewer or less don't have. So there's higher rate of disabilities at lower income levels, what it's telling us. So now we think about the housing stock a little bit. So the housing units that we have in town. So we're looking at structure type, which just refers to, is it a single family home? Is it a townhome? Is it an apartment building, a big one, a small one? And we break it down by ownership and renter. So on the ownership side, housing is predominantly detached single family. So single family homes, there are some attached single family and not a whole lot of multifamily. So if you want a condo, if you want to own a multifamily unit, you don't really have an option here in Greenfield. Renters, there's not so many single family detached homes. Most of the renter housing stock is either attached, so townhomes or duplexes, those sorts of things, or larger triplexes, quadplexes, or apartment buildings. So there's a mismatch between the ownership and the renter housing stock, which means you're kind of pigeonholed into a certain typology depending on if you can afford to own or if you'd rather rent. And we look at bedroom count too, because there's a strong relationship between household size and structure and how many bedrooms you need. And again, a bit of a mismatch. On the ownership side, nearly all ownership units are 2 beds or more. And about half of the rental units are smaller than that. So if you need a smaller unit, but maybe you want to own that unit, you don't really have that choice here in Greenfield. There's a bit of a mismatch there. And if you need a larger unit, there aren't so many options in the rental stock you would need to purchase if you can afford to for that type of housing. So the age of existing housing is also a way to chronicle the development history of the community. Pretty much everything that was built here was built before 1960. Much of the city was built before the Second World War, and the pace of construction has very slowly fallen off and has been very, very slow recently. Not so many units built over the past decade. We've got a chart on building permits too that breaks that out a bit more. So building housing has not been, people have talked about Greenfield as a declining population for a long time. And so maybe that's why there's not a whole lot of housing built. It could also be that population's declining because there's not enough housing built. There's a really relationship between those two. Now we look at the amount of what we call committed affordable housing units. These are subsidized units or deed restricted units. So these are units that are required in some way to be maintained as affordable, either in perpetuity or for an extended period of time. So the top one, LIHTC, those are tax credit units. They have expiration dates, and they last about 15 to 30 years before they need to be renewed. And a good chunk of those would be coming due for renewal this decade. And so depending on who you talk to, that's either a scary thought that we're about to lose 200 affordable units, or not so scary because under certain circumstances, developers never intend to take those out of the affordability stock because of the way that they finance them, the way they're managing them, or they belong to nonprofits who, that's their mission. So we could look into that a bit more. It's just to say that there are a lot of different types of affordable housing programs, and each has its own constraints, its own benefits, and a number of different agents that administer them and use them to develop. So there's vouchers, there's public housing. These are all managed by different people, but they all serve the same population. And overall, Greenfield's 15% affordable, which is a pretty high level in Massachusetts. Massachusetts is communities are required to be at 10% or higher. If you're not at 10%, then you're subject to some other rules that some communities don't like. where developers can pretty much build what they want to build if you don't let them. The 40Bs, if you've heard of that before. So Greenfield's not subject to that, but that's not to say we shouldn't think about building more affordable housing units either. So then let's think geographically a little bit and just map some of those indicators we talked about before. So here, cost burden renters. So these are renters that are having a harder time paying for housing. They're really spread throughout the community, slightly more concentrated in and around downtown, south of Silver Street there. Cost burden homeowners are slightly more concentrated in certain areas, south and west of downtown, but cost burden is everywhere too, to some degree. Is everyone oriented on this map? Are you able to see where we are?
Yeah, John? John?
Yes, it's
question. Are you going to address REITs? Because one of the interesting thing I've heard, I've been back here for about 9 months. Certainly, I'm in the northern side of Greenfield, and there are representatives from REITs literally walking around the neighborhoods, knocking on doors, trying to get people to sell property, which has significant implications, both short and long term.
And for what purpose?
For what purpose are they looking to buy?
Is this just, yeah.
Well, it's unfortunately, it's a national phenomenon that's enabling corporations to buy private housing and then either hold them off the market in order to jack up the prices of other properties that they own, or do that kind of as an ensemble in terms of using it to push up prices in general, which certainly has implications for this community.
So we see that phenomenon all over the place at different scales. Single family rentals is a growing trend. And so out-of-state landlords is another way of thinking about it. People that purchase properties as investments might not be from the community. They might be located somewhere far away. They're trying to build a portfolio of property in a specific neighborhood so that they can control pricing sometimes. A lot of times this can contribute to kind of taking the bottom out from urban neighborhoods in particular. We encountered it a lot in Indianapolis, for example, where whole neighborhoods will get swept up. It's not as prominent as some people would like you to believe in some places, but it's an emerging trend that kind of is at different stages in different places. So that's something we could look at with the city. They kind of can disguise who they are by the LLC name they use to purchase property, and they can, to roll them up. It's hard to tell exactly who's doing that, but we could look into it to see if that's an emerging phenomenon here. And maybe there might be tools to counteract it, or at least make sure that when those investments are made and those properties are consolidated, they're still managed to a minimum level of standard. Because a lot of times, code violations come into play. These people aren't there to mow the lawn. They put it on the tenant. They fine the tenant in certain ways. Massachusetts has a lot of tenant protection rules. In Indiana, it's the Wild West. So we're lucky to be in this state, but that's something that wasn't on our radar. So we'll look into it for Greenfield. And just to finish looking at this slide, this is one of the more stark disparities here, where the incomes are much lower in and around downtown than elsewhere. So now we'll look at pricing a little bit. First, sale pricing and then rental pricing. So here we're comparing home values or home sale prices to how much people are currently paying who own their home. And so the difference there is a home sale price is what you would pay today to get into that house, whereas the ownership cost is just what you happen to be paying for the mortgage you signed 10 years ago at a much different interest rate. So those tend to be lower. So here, if you break the current home sale prices into terciles, or kind of thirds, the upper third in Greenfield is approaching $400,000. The middle third is around $300,000, and the bottom third is about $250,000. So the yellow boxes show you approximately what it would cost monthly to hold a mortgage at those price points, taking into account taxes and other things as well. And so then we look at how much people in Greenfield are currently paying to own their homes. And about 45% of the homeowner population pays less than the bottom third you would need to purchase a home that's about 33% of in the bottom third of the price ranges out there on the market. So the takeaway here is that it's great that people are able to own houses more affordably than the current market would suggest, but let's say they need to make a change. What do they need? They need to sell their home, they need to downsize, upsize, move to a different place. they're going to expose themselves to the current market. They might not have enough equity to trade to be able to purchase a house in their own community, and this leads to displacement in a lot of places. So here's another way of looking at that. Can the median income afford the median priced home? So the blue line is the median home price in Greenfield, and you can see it's wiggling its way up in a lot of these graphs. One of the good things about Greenfield is the trends aren't quite as extreme here as they are in other places. In COVID, some of these lines really go off the charts. In other communities here, it's a bit more modulated, but still, the line is going up and to the right in terms of cost. And from an affordability standpoint, the green line, we're able to afford less and less. So someone making the median income in Greenfield can only afford about half of the cost of the median home price in Greenfield. Is this what this is telling us? And a lot of that is due to interest rates too. That's why the green line took a downturn a couple of years ago. Sorry, the microphone's coming.
Thank you. I don't see, I mean, are these projections made after things like groceries are considered, gas, so we're living in a time now where you're trying to make a decision whether you're going to buy groceries and feed yourself or you're going to pay for a prescription.
Yeah.
And so these numbers have to be skewed because, these people, we don't have enough money to afford to eat, buy gas, afford rent. So these numbers are just outrageous and very difficult for me to even, take seriously because it's not true.
Well, that's why affordable is in quotes. For what,
Yeah.
I mean, we use the 30% cost burden standard for that, which that's another one size doesn't fit all.
That's correct.
Some people, if you're a single person, you don't have that many expenses, maybe 30% is fine. But if you've got kids, you've got multiple people in your home, you need to make improvements, you've got other expenses in your life, 30% is too much.
That's
And,
correct.
and as you saw, especially at the lower incomes, many people
Yeah.
are stretching much further than that and are making choices like that. So that's something we can talk about at the end too. But you're right, that's behind the scenes also.
Yeah.
Even setting that aside, it's still hard to afford housing.
That's correct. It is true. Thank you.
Sure. So similar to the ownership comparison, unfortunately, Greenfield's a little small, so some data sets aren't available with enough statistical significance to use here. So in this case, I'll start with the bottom graph. So here we're showing how much people are currently paying to live in a rental housing unit. So most people, 40%, are paying less than $1,600 a month. And this is, again, it's the rent that they pay. It's also the utilities and the other standard things that the tenant typically has to pay for in an apartment. And the top chart is, there's two things going on there. The middle couple of columns did personal research because we couldn't get the data set for Greenfield. Just what are the current asking rents for apartments around town? So just looking at Craigslist, at rent.com, apartments.com, we were seeing studios averaging at about $900 a month, one bed's $1,500 or so a month, two beds $1,600 or $1,700 a month, and three beds averaging at about $2,000 a month. And compare that, so that's the current housing stock. That's almost exclusively units that are old, that have been around for a long time. Maybe they've been refurbished internally, but they weren't developed recently. A lot of times in a place like Greenfield that hasn't seen a lot of new construction development, we want to understand or think about why haven't developers been coming here and building the new housing buildings that we see in Amherst or Northampton or elsewhere. So when you query new developments that were built in the past 5 years or so, we can look at the rents that they're asking for and kind of assume that the rents they're getting are high enough that can justify the construction cost, the financing cost to build something new. And so when you look at that product within about a 45-minute radius of here, their studios are $2,000 a month. The one beds are $1,800. The two beds are $2,100. So they're meaningfully more than the Greenfield rents, but they're not double, triple the Greenfield rents. And so we could say that Greenfield's approaching the cusp where new market rate development might be feasible in the foreseeable future. Not today, but that's something that maybe if we wanted to see more market rate development, it might be something that could be achieved. And one thing we've seen is often it's debatable, but because there's not higher cost housing, people who want to live in Greenfield have to kind of take up all the lower cost housing. That's all that's available. And it creates a lot more competition at the lower rungs of the ladder. So we often think about providing housing across the spectrum, not just at the top, not just at the bottom. So there isn't so much competition between people of different means for the same housing unit. So this is a hypothetical, but it's always helpful, gap analysis. So this is comparing the needs of the current residents. So we look at the full, the incomes of the people who live here and their household size and everything, and estimate, not look at where they live today, but estimate what type of housing unit would they want to live in, would be a good fit for them from a cost standpoint, a bedroom count standpoint, if they could move tomorrow into the unit that's just right for them. Because as we all know, our housing needs change over time. So the top chart tells us that. So the different tone bars tell us how many bedrooms. So as you make your way from left to right, it's larger units, more bedrooms, cheaper units at the top, more expensive units at the bottom. So let's compare that to what we have in the community right now. So the yellow columns there are telling us if there's not enough of a given unit size or cost, or too many. If it's negative, there's too many. If it's positive, there's not enough. And so what we see is that there's not enough smaller units, given what we would expect the current population would be looking for today. And there's too many larger units. And then on the cost side, there's not enough cheaper units, and there's too many more expensive units. And this isn't always surprising, but I think one thing that people don't think about enough, I mean, cost is always at the forefront of people's minds, but it's also the size of the unit. It's the design of the unit. It's the accessibility of the unit, the location of the unit. The alignment between what people need and what's available needs to work at in those dimensions as well. So we've been looking at the development trajectory as we start to transition to just how many units do we need? How should we plan for that? Not a whole lot of units have been, well, we look at the permitting data, which isn't a perfect, not every unit that gets permitted gets built, but it's a bit of a leading indicator into what's going to get built. About 70 units have been permitted over the past decade, to the best of our estimates, talking to the city and looking through the records. So that's a pretty slow pace, but the pace looks like it might be quickening quite a bit. There's a number of new housing developments on the horizon right now in various stages of planning and permitting. So this is an inventory of those, again, working with the city to try to catch the major ones there. And it's we're looking at 150, 200 units or more in the pipeline right now that could be built in the next several years, and a wide range of unit types. So the Wilson's development, for example, is everyone familiar with the Wilson's development? 61, those are affordable units right downtown with the grocery store downstairs. At the other end of the spectrum, they're smaller, like 187 Hope Street is just a couple of units done by a small developer. That's been supported by CPA funding, so Community Preservation Act funding. So each of these is, very few of these projects just kind of happen on their own. That's one takeaway here. Each one kind of has a patchwork of players, of programs to put the pieces together, but many of them are starting to come together. So we are seeing a bit of a shift in the momentum here.
I was just wondering how many bedrooms do you have an estimate for each of these new developments? Are they 1, 2, 3, 4 bedroom?
I don't have that information. It's probably not been established. I mean, you could assume that the larger units have fewer bedrooms. I mean, the larger projects have fewer bedrooms. The 60 Wells Street, there's shelter beds mixed in there. So those are as small as it gets. I forget what the Wilson's development is. Often it's a mix and they get kind of larger than you would expect. Yeah, so there's some 3 bedrooms in that project. To the extent we can, we'll get that information, because that's part of, a lot of times we set our goals, we set our production targets, and then we look at what we're building. And sometimes it's, wait, we're going down the wrong path, or like we're working in Alexandria, Virginia right now, and their development pipeline is totally out of whack with what they need. It's just way more fancy luxury product, and they're not really taking a very big bite out of many of the other needs. So that's a wake-up call for them. That's why we do these sorts of plans, so we can do something similar here. So most of this development, most of the units are in and around downtown, but the projects are spread elsewhere as well. So just to harken back to the idea of market rate developers, when I say market rate, I just mean developers that don't need affordable housing subsidies. There might be other subsidies that play into the pro forma there. But when you think about the Western Mass region overall, there's a number of people moving around every year, and that kind of constitutes what we would say is the market pool for new housing every year. And so just to cut to the chase there, we think there's demand for up to 45 market rate housing units per year in Greenfield, just drawing from the churn of people that are moving in and out of other parts of the community, and also moving to Western Mass from somewhere else altogether. So this could be, this represents this is what those developers are looking for when they're looking for a market rate project. Is the buying power out there in the market? Can we imagine people nearby being able to afford this to justify the investment? And we think that there is that justification in Greenfield. So last couple of thoughts here. When we think about the household growth over the past 10 years, so it's true that Greenfield's population hasn't been growing, or if it grows a tiny amount, but that's the number of people. The number of households continues to grow in most communities, in large part because household sizes are shrinking, such that you can have, that's the average number of people in a household. So you can have less people overall, but more households because the households are smaller than they were. And sure enough, Greenfield is adding households. So that's a much more relevant metric when you're trying to plan for housing. So we would project 417 net new households over the next 10 years. So obviously some people are going to come and go every year, but on balance over 10 years, there'll be 417 more households than there are today. And you need more housing units than just that 417. There's a number of standard adjustments that one can make to account for other aspects of just kind of good housing stock hygiene, as we put it. So in some cases, there's a lot of overcrowding, for example, where there's too many people living in housing units, largely driven by prices, multiple people kind of piling into a unit. And so you might need to add a little bit of extra housing stock to alleviate that pressure. That's not a problem here. Replacement housing is just a factor that recognizes that you've got to replace some units over time. Some burn down, some are just inadequate, need to be revitalized, renovated. So we just have a standard rate of replacement there. The vacancy rate is fine, and substandard adjustment refers to units that are uninhabitable for other reasons, and that's not a problem here either. But bottom line is, we think that Greenfield should plan for 486 new housing units over the next 10 years to keep up with projected growth. And like other projections, in some ways, growth is a choice. You don't have to grow. If you don't build any more units, you won't grow. If you build a lot more units, you might grow more than where this bar is. This is kind of a placeholder for us to talk about it, I think, because this is up to the community. How do you want your future to look? How much do you want to develop? How much do you want to augment the housing stock that you have today?